Was that guy did not wash his hands after exiting the female bathroom. But
Oh,
Interesting. He's remained super bugged or become immune to diseases.
Well, you know what?
I'm pretty sure you can still get other things like hepatitis.
I don't know about that, but you can get a lot of things from washing your hands. Plus,
There's lots of my working in restaurants. You have a task not washing your hands after the bathroom. I'll give other people, not yourself.
yeah, I mean, if you already have it, yeah.
After that, he's speaking.
okay, cool. I got some stuff left to figure out.
I'm gonna try to Oh wait, does he have blue pen? Oh yeah, Tom threw me. Threw my blue pen. Terrible catch. Okay, I'm ready now, sorry. Yeah.
Observation 1 is resolutional analysis. The 1 point is the resolution. Yemen should hold a binding referendum to determine the sovereignty of its southern region. The 2nd point is the judging criteria, which we argued for, which is net benefits. Whichever side is the best rule postal plan by viewing the facts. So when you go for the 3 point is all definitions defined contextually. Observation 2 is the background. The first argument under this is that there's loose correlation of rights groups that have formed in southern Yemen. The Hirak is a southern rights movement, which is actually attempting to give rights to southern movement, but it actually was in 2011 added by a secessionalist statement, which actually emerged to try to give diplomatic and governmental independence to the southern region. The second argument here is that there's been the second argument here is, just grabs that, that's the plan. Yemen should hold a binding referendum to determine the sovereignty of its southern region. Scratch out the word actor on that, by the way. Fighting enforcement through normal means. I repeat, Yemen should hold a binding referendum to determine the sovereignty of its southern region.
Question?
Yeah.
What will be the outcome of the referendum?
We just defend the referendum passage. We're not going to think the outcome is. Can't be up that one. Advantage number 1 is violence. Subpoint A is the uniqueness. The first argument here is that the southern rights groups have seen violence in the status quo. The Hirak is made up of 7 groups which are all fractured in the status quo. Additionally, I say the example that they've led to large protests as well. The second argument here is that since this has happened, the North has started to strike down on the South. We actually, as an example, there's been economic effects which have taken away land, as well as the fact that the World Economic Forum found that since the revolution, there has also been a worse situation for women in the South, where there's been a massive strike down against them. The third argument here is the North has taken an act of exclusion to the South in order to try to deter protests. The Northern president has specifically given away oil rights and land rights from the Southern citizens, and this is an attempt to backlash against large protests that the Southern citizens have done to try to get away from Yemen and protest some of the things that are going on against them. The fourth argument here is that current talks of cooperation in the Gulf Cooperation will fail. The Gulf Cooperation has actually made a group of Gulf states that are attempting to have talks to mitigate the conflict in the status quo. This will fail for a couple of reasons. We'd isolate the example that 1, they don't actually encompass any of the southern citizens in the status quo, as well as the fact that they're all dominated by the talks of the government of Yemen, which means they're side with the government of the status quo, as well as the fact that many of the issues of things like land rights and southern citizens are not part of the talk, which I say the high likelihood that they will not come to any terms. Subpoint B is the impacts. The first argument is that 3,000 people will die and will continue to die. We would isolate the example that since the uprising, there's been 3,000 dead. Our security forces this month have already clashed with Haqqari forces. We'd also isolate the example that this has been an armed conflict, and also that all of the protests that happen are met with armed response by security forces in the status quo. The problem right now is that Haqqari is not seen as a legitimate political force, so then they are backlashed against. We'd also isolate the example that this is also the risk of many other lives because it leads to regional stability. The second argument here is that the North crackdown will only get worse, causing causing a civil war. Our argument is as long as the South is seen as not a politically valuable force and group that the North will continue to clamp down on them and try to strike back, our argument then becomes that leads to regional instability. When these two forces clash, it risks the entire population as well as the surrounding states, because they can then have civil wars bleed over to them. This has been empirically proven in parts of Africa where civil wars have actually caused instability to other countries, which should be a pretty good reason about how it causes regional instability. Some point C is the solvency. The first argument here is that this plan stops the protests. Our argument is that right now many of the protests don't lack legitimacy from the government, which means that the plan is an act of giving legitimacy to these individuals, as well as allowing for the elections to be held. It means that the protests can be quelled right now. The second argument is right now there's no political voice for the protesters. Our argument is that one of the things they lack is a political voice in the institution of the government, which in Yemen, which is a reason why specifically there's a lack of representation. What I think the example by allowing for referendum to be held, it gives them some feel of a voice, which we think could solve and clamp down with the problem. The third argument is that we also, I say the example, give legitimacy to the political groups, which means they move more towards the center. Our argument is that every time legitimacy is granted by a governing institution, the groups try to move towards the center. I say the example of Hamas in the West Bank, which won political elections, but have now then disavowed most of the uses of violence in the West Bank, which indicates a high likelihood that when political groups win, they actually move more towards the center and less towards extremism. Advantage 2 is non-state actors. Subpoint A is the uniqueness. The first argument is that large government crackdown and protests have all increased Al-Qaeda recruitment in the status quo. Would I say the example that since the 2011 protests, new Al-Qaeda skirmishes have happened against the government? And also, I say the example that since the uprising against Saleh, which happened as part of the Arab Spring, this has actually caused him to continue to live in the country, which caused large protests in the country, and well, an Al-Qaeda backlash in the status quo. And this is indicative of a system that does not respect individuals who are living with it. Instead, forces Al-Qaeda to become the group for many of the southern secessionists try to side with. The second argument here is this is a unique spot for recruitment and for a few reasons. I say the example that the North is giving away large amounts of oil and land rights, which has caused the government to seem delegitimized, which has led a backfill for the Al-Qaeda to fill the gap. And also, I say the example that Al-Qaeda has actually started distributing water and land because the government no longer does this, and so Al-Qaeda has actually become the legitimate governing force in this region. The fourth argument is that lack of control leads to a concrete solution as part of the problem. Would isolate the example that Saleh has been labeled by international articles as the Mubarak of Yemen. The problem is that Mubarak was killed and a new government was formed. Instead, Saleh stepped down and his essential government still existed. He exists as a quasi-governmental force. This allows for a deep schism within Yemen, southern Yemen, where they have to have a backlash and move on to groups like Al-Qaeda for some sort of like resources in order to continue to exist. This leads to the impacts. Subpoint B. The first argument is violence. Our argument is Al-Qaeda continues to skirmish with the governmental body, which is a pretty high level of violence and regional stability. The second argument here is that we also say that non-state actor violence risks bioweapons and other massive attacks. That's because the CIA profiled bioweapons in southern Yemen. We would isolate the example that as we continue with political instability, that has a higher perpetuation of bioweapons. The bioweapons are uniquely dangerous in world politics because they don't have a blast radius. Instead, they can spread throughout multiple countries, which is a high likelihood this contaminate and lead to things like human extinction, which we would isolate an example from. Things like weaponized smallpox could happen. Subpoint C is the solvency. The first argument, the plan gives legitimacy to the movement. Our argument that when you give legitimacy to a political movement, even if they lose elections, they try to move more towards the center to then grapple on to more moderate supporters. We would isolate the example of Hamas, the IRA, and the hippie movement in the United States all moved more towards the middle after they got political legitimacy in the 1970s with the hippie movement and with the IRA. We can also isolate the example of the second argument. The plan also gives a voice, which means that they can break away from the resources of Al-Qaeda. So that's cool. Al-Qaeda attacks all that these secessionist groups have. Our argument is that after this, we give them some kind of political legitimacy where our election is held. Even if they lose it, they still have a referendum that was positive for them. What's the order?
The order is 2 off, and then the affirmative case in order.
Just want to hold them along.
Not
Critically.
Cool.
We should be fluid on.
Remind you, a short piece of paper. It's actually easier for me.
Sorry, what was the order?
2 and then the case.
Cool.
Alright. The counterplan, Yemen should convene a collaborative public process to include all relevant stakeholders and vested parties over whether Yemen should hold a binding referendum to determine the sovereignty of its southern region. Again, Yemen should convene a collaborative public process including all relevant stakeholders and vested parties over whether Yemen should hold a binding referendum to determine the sovereignty of its southern region. There's your property, any questions?
Not at this time. Actually, conditional?
Yes.
Okay.
The counterplan competes. It is functionally competitive because it severs out of the immediacy of the plan by delaying decision-making over until after the negotiation. Second is that the counterplan uses a different procedural method than the affirmative case. This means that you vote against the argument permutation to the counterplan because it's an attempt to steal coordinated ground and make the debate about generics, which means that it's impossible for us to have clash or depth of education, which is the point of why we come to debate. Third argument is that it competes through net benefits. The solvency process, the plan solves the affirmative. It creates an opportunity for people of distinct perspectives to collaborate and to make policies that are sufficiently needed and that are sufficiently understand the history of the area. Second argument is that the counterplan creates the best borders. Empirically, we will show that the collaborative process, like Camp David, having key to successful policymaking and border creation. Third argument is that the counterplan jives best with the Yemenis culture than the affirmative. There's a long tradition of the Wasdaq who like the peacemakers in the nominal culture was responsible for looking at the interests of the entire community and creating an integrated solution. Fourth argument is that the plan would fail because it's seen as another instance of Western imperialism and neoliberalism. Gut check their arguments about democracy promotion. They're in the same logic that leads to intervention in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. Fifth argument is that your plan will fail because there are 7 million people in northern Yemen compared to the 2.5 million people in the southern half, which means that your affirmative referendum never actually passes anything that appeases people in the south. Sixth argument is unlike the affirmative, the counterplan is the beginning, not an endpoint, which means that we create a form for relationship building, which is keep the internal links of the affirmative solvency. Next. The disadvantage, the uniqueness, first argument is that the global secession movements are resolved through peaceful compromise in the status quo because the international pressure of unified support shows that support is unified and countries and advocates are against secession movements. The delay is Southern and North Sudan are both complying with UN plans and for demilitarizing the border. Second, little b is in Turkey. The Turkish government is working with the Kurdish rebels to stop the ongoing conflict in the region. Second argument is that Northern Yemen and Eastern Yemen are supporting a unified Yemen right now, and they're cooperating and not asking for any secession. The Link's first argument is that you flip the shift on the international perception of secession movements and make it look like they will generate international support. Second is that this increases militarization of the Blue Nile region of Sudan and reignites the conflict for oil and displacement in current inhabitants. South Sudan will try to overtake the region and get it to succeed, while Sudan will want to keep it for oil. Third argument is that the plan makes the Kurds believe that the international community will support Kurdish independence. This kills the peace process and reignites conflicts. The internal links is that this creates an ethnic conflict for both Turkey and the Blue Nile region. Independent reason to vote against the affirmative team. Small-scale conflicts destabilize the region and cause more death every year than would occur in a nuclear war. In addition, it also causes individuals to be ignored, which leads to a lack of healthcare, education, and food and water security. Second argument is militarization in Sudan creates conflict with China, where we want to extract oil from the Blue Nile region. This draws in the international actors and escalates proxy conflict between the U.S. and China. Third argument is that Turkish-Kurdish peace is also key to regional stability and to preventing terrorism in the region. It also is key to securing the borders and preventing Iran from funneling weapons into the Syrian government. The impact is that this turns the case because this causes more secessionist movements in eastern Yemen and it delegitimizes the regime. Second argument is terrorism. This internally linked turns advantage too because it causes more terrorism within the region, which we think will spill over. In addition, Turkey's instability is allowing Iran to launder money through Kurdish regions in Yemen, leading to an ability to maintain their nuclear weapons program. Little a is Iran is supporting Syria and is causing Assad to use chemical weapons and allowing for the expansion of biological weapons, which probably will internally link turn the second advantage. But little b is both the Kurdish region of Turkey and the Blue Nile region are also hotbeds for terrorism and conflict. There is also increasing the recruitment incentive for action. We control the internal exterior next. Your question?
Yeah. So back about your unique story. Your unique story that secession movements exist now, that they're going through one framework, or that they're stalled now. Such
Our
as,
arguments that secession movements are being channeled through peaceful negotiations in the status quo. Your plan disrupts that.
Okay. The advantage one. First argument is that alternative actors can solve violence like the U.S. and the UN. Second argument is that you increase violence because you prevent voices from actually being heard, which means that it causes an enormous amount of overshadowing. This makes civil war absolutely inevitable. Next argument is a turn Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia supports a unified government in Yemen right now, and they fear instability over one of the most populous countries in the region, and they Yemen is heavily armed, and they also flank shipping lanes. Saudi Arabia is cultivating close relationships with Yemeni leaders like Ali Hussein, who is a relative of Saleh, and the Yemenis leaders who are principal clients of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia perceives the referendum as taking their puppet government out of power, which means that they give support to the central government to do things like cheat, like quarantine people and move people around so that the referendum is ineffective, or Saudi Arabia rolls in to preserve a unified state and they use military intervention just like they did in Bahrain during the Arab Spring, where they sent in tanks to stop people from protesting against the government in support of a renegotiation of power distribution. This means that the Saudi military occupation ignites enormous amounts of conflict, makes terrorism inevitable, also makes violence inevitable, which means that it turns advantage one and advantage two. Second argument is the referendum will not work. Those arguments are made on the counterplan about how South Yemen makes up South Yemen is 1/3 of the population of North Yemen, and only very few people in South Yemen actually support a referendum, which means that they wouldn't abide by whatever the plan results in. It would only when their voices are heard in a world of the counterplan are we capable of getting an actual negotiation of borders. Next argument is that the South is trying to opt out because they think that the North will overwhelm their vote, which means that the plan only causes more turmoil in the South. Only the counterplan is capable of resolving this. Advantage two. First argument is that we can solve bioweapons through things like nanotechnology and vaccines and international stocks. Also, bioweapons would hurt the people who distribute the bioweapons, which means that it's a very low probability that bioweapons will actually be used. Our scenario about chemical weapons and governmental distribution of bioweapons is much more likely. Also, the next argument is that you don't solve because local corruption, local leaders lack the ability to govern well. This is recognized in the National Decentralization Strategy, which is part of the President's strategy plan through 2015. Leaders are cultivating support through Yemen, and the public is overwhelmingly skeptical of the government, which means that non-state actor control is absolutely inevitable in a world of the plan where you don't give any more government credibility because you take voices away from the individuals who would actually be distributing the power through the government. Second argument is that you cause a takeover by non-state actors because the leader of the separatist movement has been taking money from Iran and the status quo and funding Al-Qaeda through it. This means that you make a failed state absolutely inevitable because you don't change any power distribution and you in fact put him in more power, if anything. Next argument is that the South is one of the most water-scarce areas of the entirety of the world, which means that the people who live in the South are incapable of doing things like agriculture, which makes poverty and starvation inevitable. This creates the conditions that allow violence and that allow non-state actors to create a system of more recruitment because it is seen as the only thing that can happen for survival, which means that only in a world where we can renegotiate borders in a way that is beneficial to people in the South, where they aren't just stuck with the land that is water scarce, are we capable of having a good resolution and move away from the conditions that make terrorism inevitable and that make terrorism possible, which only happens with the counterplan.
Okay. It will be a new sheet of paper on top, followed by advantage 1, advantage 2, the counterplan, and the dissect. Is everyone ready? Does anyone need a minute?
I'm good.
Okay. The new sheet of paper is delay that. The A is the interpretation. The negative gets the right to one counterplan that happens immediately again. Or rather, the negative team gets access to one counterplan that does not delay the implementation of the affirmative. Again, negative team gets access to one counterplan that does not delay the implementation of the affirmative. These violations that they actually delay the implementation of the affirmative. That's the only reason they can list you as the Y. The counterplan is competitive. The C is the standard. First going to be ground. We think it's impossible for us to leverage the small time frame deficit of the affirmative against that of the counterplan. This sheet makes it impossible for us to make any sort of uniqueness claims, such as how but at the answer to this, it's impossible to determine what the world will look like at the time the negotiations have ended, which indicates that we do not have the ability to leverage any predictable offense against. In addition, the fact that we will not be able to make these arguments indicates that these uses already happened. You reading the counterplan has already made us well behind in this debate. Second argument is going to be reciprocity. The affirmative can't delay the implementation of their plan, which means that it is unfair for the negative to be able to delay the interpretation of theirs. But the third is going to be predictability. They could delay an infinite amount of time or even a couple seconds. It indicates that there's no way for us to predict what their counterplan is going to be. Additionally, we think predictability is absolutely key. That's to be able to leverage an effective affirmative strategy. We have to be able to predict on some level what the negative will say to be able to preempt it in the PMC. The D is first and a priori. If it doesn't come first, it comes last. Second is competing interpretations. Even the best interpretations will win. Let's go to advantage 1. They make the arguments that the UN will solve, and then by increasing violence and silence voices. First argument is that the UN has done nothing to solve it. They don't even have peacekeepers there, nor are they providing any increases of aid to Southern Yemen, which indicates even if the UN could solve, they aren't. But the second argument is that we do not increase violence by silencing voices. Our argument is that even if the Southern Yemenis don't win, we actually give them a voice by allowing them to become a part of the democratic process, which indicates we will actually decrease the silencing of the voices, which is actually happening right now for our own uniqueness arguments. In addition, you make the Saudi Arabia argument. The first argument is this is absolutely non-unique because Saudi Saudi Arabia is launching massive attacks in southern Yemen right now. They've launched a ton of airstrikes and have been doing so since January. It indicates there's only a risk that the affirmative could resolve this impact. It's happening in the status quo. Second argument is non-unique. It's about to increase right now because they've actually trying to buy new Apache helicopters from the United States in order to increase these attacks. Third argument is turn the plan will actually increase stability, which will appease Saudi Arabia. The reason Saudi Arabia wants to get involved in this region in the first place is because of an increase in extremist recruitment and because they think it could destabilize the region in a world in which they transition to democracy, which they generally will think is US-backed, and in a world in which they can decrease al-Qaeda recruitment and increase the movement toward more legitimate political parties. This will indicate that they are always going to like this plan, which would be a reason why they won't have to get involved. The fourth argument is the US would deter any major incursion because they would fear losing all US military and humanitarian aid, which is the reason why Saudi Arabia would never do this. Additionally, they say the referendum won't work and that the South will lose. That's fine. We don't even need this argument to get sovereignty. Our argument is that just by the act of having the referendum, it would legitimize the actual political parties, which means that they don't have to just protest blindly or join al-Qaeda. You've conceded all of these arguments, which indicates that just a mere act of engaging in this referendum will solve back the entirety of the affirmative. You should not have dropped these solvency arguments. We do not need to win that southern Yemen becomes an actual country. The issue say turn the plan would increase turmoil. You are well behind in the uniques today because this is actually happening in the status quo. But the second argument is that you've conceded Kyle's number 3 solvency argument, which is the plan would increase the legitimacy of the Iraq, which means that they will coalesce around the central movement. That means that they will move away from the extreme right and left and actually coalesce centrist to become centrist, which will decrease the internal turmoil. You should not have conceded this argument. Will absolutely get us out of this. In addition, you can extend an argument that a northern crackdown will lead to a civil war, which causes instability. That would probably make all of your dissads inevitable because regional instability means that Turkey will have to crack down against the PKK in order to stabilize their borders. Advance to. They make the argument that nanotech solves bioweapons. That's fine. We do not need to go for these bioweapon arguments. Additionally, they say no solvency because of corruption. The first argument, this is empirically not true because they voted out Saleh in an election, indicates that they're actually able to kick their ruling party out of power. The second argument is that the new leaders have actually implemented a massive election reform within Yemen, which indicates that this union is outdated. But the third argument is that a legitimate party would absolutely solve. In a world in which they have a more legitimate political party, they will not necessarily have, or they will be able to stand up and say no to the corruption, which is the reason why the affirmative would solve this argument. Issues say turn, the plan would increase al-Qaeda by propping up the southern leader. The one is we've extended the southern leader would absolutely lose, which would be a reason why this is never going to happen. But the second argument is you've again conceded that the people are going to move away from the extremes like al-Qaeda and move towards the central government. And in a world where they have a viable political party that can create change without necessarily having to go through extreme means like al-Qaeda, they will always choose going through the political process as opposed to getting shot at in the streets. For that issue, you say that poverty is inevitable, which means that there will be some level of violence and active improvement. The one is this is empirically disproven. And say it's like Malawi, which is one of the more poorest countries in the entire world, and it has virtually no extremist presence because they also have legitimate forms of government and democracy, which indicates that as a prerequisite to decreasing extremism. The second argument is you can see that they would rather go through the political process than have risk dying through a conflict, which indicates we will absolutely get solvency. In addition, you can extend the argument that al-Qaeda leads to massive violence, kills a ton of people, we absolutely get solvency. Let's go to the counterclaim. First argument is no solvency because the crackdown will continue during the collaborative process. Yours is the delay counterclaim, which means that the implementation of the referendum won't happen for a long time. That means in the interim, the government will continue to kill the civilians. It means that you are going to have thousands of more people die in the world of the counterclaim because it delays the implementation. The affirmative solves quicker, makes the entirety of the advantage when it dissatisfies the counterclaim. Second argument is no solvency because you can't actually solve for the legitimacy, which indicates that a long drawn-out process means that the people will not view the central or the new party that springs up as being nearly as legitimate. Additionally, they will think that it is actually a puppet state that was created by the central government because all relevant stakeholders, including the corrupt northern government, is involved in the creation of the party, which means they will never move towards it. They will always continue to support al-Qaeda. Third argument is that you will have a massive time frame deficit because in the interim, al-Qaeda will still continue to kill people and will still continue to try to destabilize the region, which indicates you're at a massive solvency deficit. Additionally, the next argument is the plan would solve the collaboration net benefit because this will lead to increased political collaboration through mainstream things like democracy, which indicates that the parties will actually be able to engage in collaboration. Additionally, the act of going out and voting and having a referendum is collaborative. You can have discussion and forums about it. Additionally, they say it's neoliberalist, but it's not the U.S. calling for it. It is Yemen, who is a nation that has been colonized, taking this action. Indicates that this is not colonialism or neoliberalism, and there's no reason why saying democracy is good is necessarily neoliberalist, nor have you read an impact to this. Additionally, we don't need to win that South gets independence. In fact, we now say that it probably does. Let's go to the dissent. First argument is this is absolutely non-unique. Secessionist movements are violent and failing in the status quo. The ace of point is that there's this massive Israeli settlement that's happening in the West Bank. Despite a massive Palestinian movement that got support from the UN, Israel is still engaging in a massive settlement called the E1 plan, by which they plan to encircle and remove all territorial aspirations of the Palestinian people. No uniqueness. But the thesis point is countries like Somaliland and Ogderland, which are trying to break out of just right by the Blue Nile region are actually being denied by the ruling governments, which indicate that there's absolutely no peaceful process right now. There are massive crackdowns happening with all these movements. Second argument is not unique because secessionist movements are failing right now because we refuse, the United States and other nations refuse to recognize the independence movements of Palestine or Somaliland or Abdul land, indicates that there's still no recognition. But the third argument is no link because we think that if this process actually fails, if it does not lead to the increase of, if it does not lead to the creation of a new South Yemen, then nobody will want to model it. If the process itself does not lead to a new country, no one will model it. They'll just keep doing the same current framework, which means that there's absolutely no link to this side. Fourth argument is turn. The plan will incentivize a move towards more peaceful reconciliation. If it shows that this can actually decrease the perception of Al-Qaeda, this will mean that people will try to move more away from cracking down on the governments and move more towards trying to engage in peaceful reconciliation and things like collaboration, which they will view democracy as. The next argument is turn. The plan will disincentivize government crackdowns because it will show that creating a viable political party and allowing them to engage with that will actually decrease the extremist recruitment, which indicates that if we win any solvency for case, then we will win our ability to solve for this disadvantage. But the next argument is turn. The plan will set a precedent for governments calling for referendums. That the government of Yemen calling for it will actually decrease the violence. This will show that it's better if the government calls for it than for outside forces. But the next argument is recruitment of extremists is already high. You conceded that for weakness. But the last argument is that Turkey will never crack down because they will fear losing all U.S. military and humanitarian aid, which would be a reason why this would never happen.
The order is going to be the case, advantage 1, advantage 2, then the counter plan with the theory on top, and then the disadvantage. Does anyone have any questions?
No. Advantage 1, advantage 2, counter plan 3, counter plan proper, this side. Cool.
You're not going to be able to gain any access to your case when you can see that the referendum fails and that the South is still going to be a part of Yemen. This means that in a world post-plan, the only thing that happens is that the far right gets more emboldened because they view the plan as simply an ingenuine process to appease outside actors and not an actual attempt at political reform. You can see that this referendum is going to fail, which means no reason why they would feel engaged within the political processes. The only way that you're accessing the solvency for engagement is by having the two parties cooperate with each other. The counter plan is always going to generate a bigger net benefit off of this because it engages in a better form of cooperation. In addition, the counter plan avoids the disadvantage to emboldening extremists in both Yemen and Turkey, which is going to mean you vote negative on the case proper. First argument that you make is that the first argument that I want to extend is case number 3, argument on advantage 1, which says that the referendum fails. We articulate that the referendum failing means that extremists within the region are going to view the political process as not being genuine, as being a system, a political system in which they are not capable of advocating for themselves, not capable of creating change within. This means that the solvency goes the opposite way than the 1AC articulates. When people see the political system having a negative effect on them, when they see the political system ignoring their voices that occur within the referendum, it means that they're simply going to be emboldened and need to go to other means besides political reconciliation in order to solve the problem. This turns your case because it increases the hard right response. It does not create an increase in legitimacy or a centrist movement. There's no reason to do this because people simply go further right and further right because they don't think that they're going to be able to cooperate. In addition, you're not gaining the solvency for advantage 1 at the point which you're not articulating that these movements are going to be able to stop because we turned your solvency. Go to advantage 2. You can see that you can't solve for bioweapons, indicate that you have no impact coming off of this advantage. At the end of the round, you're simply going for that they increase because of the political party. Again, we're going to look at the counter plan capable of solving this best. To say it's not rooted in the ruling party, they're having election reform within the world of the status quo. Look, none of these reforms are going to mean anything at the point where it is still a stage of transition. This is a reason why we shouldn't have a referendum now while the election process is still uncertain. There's a reason why we should instead engage in negotiations until the election process comes out and is capable of being stable. This means that you see legitimacy of the party is capable of solving. This doesn't. People will see the party has failed to gain independence, which means again turning the solvency advantage 2 as well. What is the theory, please? First argument is that with the interpretation, we're not a delayed counter plan. We're not feeling that the plan happens at a different time. Instead, we are changing the way in which the plan is implemented. Instead of simply having a referendum, we're going to have multiple parties engage and decide what the best resolution to the conflict between the North and South is. This means we're going to your interpretation. The next argument is counter-interpretation. The negative team is one counter plan that has the methodological implementation of the 1AC. This is always going to be best for a couple of reasons. The first reason is education. We say that this is the most relevant education because policymakers constantly have to decide what is the best way in which to engage problems, what is this method and avenue that's best capable of being able to solve for the issues that they wish to solve for. The next argument is that this is going to be key. That this is key to negative ground. In a world in which we can't test the method, it means we have no ability to advocate for the. It means we have to resort to things like picks, of picking out of part of the 1AC, which are always going to be worse for front of ground because they take the entirety of it. The next argument, we go into their standards. They say that the ground claims that that doesn't allow them to make unique claims. You get the entirety of these saying no complaint. You get the negotiations don't work, which means nothing happens. This is a solvency takeout that allows you to generate office and allows you to win your 1AC, means that no unique ground loss happens. In addition, you can read disadvantages to the positive outcome of the resolution. In addition, this links just as part of the 1AC and it's reciprocal. You don't defend the outcome you don't defend what the outcome of your plan would be. Ask me this question in point of order. You say you do not know, means that it's reciprocal. Next, you say that the abuse already happens. We articulate and reject the argument on the team. At worst, to reject the counter plan and allow them to get the permutation. This is good because it allows us to have debate about substantive education, not simply vote, and have people resource reading theory and round which decreases topics of specific research. You say reciprocity, cross-functional above. You say predictability. We say that this is the most predictable form. This is the most predictable because it's within the literature base. Different countries engaged within the what?
Just a question whenever you're ready.
This means that different countries are capable of having negotiated within this way in the past, which means it's the most predictable. Cross-apply interpretations are going to be better. Yeah.
Okay, then how is your counterplan competitive then if it doesn't relate the interpretation? Because that's how it's phrased in
entirely different process.
It's a different method. We are engaging in consultation. We are talking and having a meeting, a forum to discuss the issue of peace between northern and southern Yemen, which will allow new solutions that we haven't thought of to be emerged. This is why the counterplan itself says the counterplan is a starting point, not an end point, which means it's going to be key to having long-term solutions. We can't simply rush into this type of political process and make a short-term decision. We need to understand all the consequences. On the counterplan. You say that this isn't capable of solving the crackdown in the country. We articulate that this is the only thing capable of solving because it provides an avenue for future negotiations, which means that people believe that the political parties are capable of working together within the future. You say this doesn't solve the legitimacy. This is the only way to solve the political party legitimacy discussions because it shows that the parties in Yemen are capable of engaging in negotiation, getting their voices heard in the international arena. You see a time frame deficit. We are going to win. That this solves for short-term conflict in the region because people see that because violence decreases in the short term because people see the negotiation process happening. In addition, we'll win a long-term solvency that shows that the negotiation process is going to lead to a beneficial outcome because we can access the solvency of your 1AC. You say that the plan calls for collaboration. That's not true. Cross-line the case today. You say this is a neoliberalism. Yemen does it. Look, piece number 3 argument on the counterplan specifically tells you that the counterplan jives better with Yemenese culture. They have a tradition of the Wasta, which is a peace negotiator. This is literally the same process that the counterplan negotiates in. It's the process that traditional Yemenese culture uses to negotiate. We articulate this is always going to be best because it's going after the best long-term solutions because we know that this is going to be successful with the people who exist in the country. In addition, it's always going to be good because it solves impacts of colonialism and neoliberalism and allows for individuals to access their cultural identity. You say we don't read the impacts of this. I find this ridiculous. We say that allowing for cultural legitimacy is an absolute prerequisite to solving for structural violence issues because it allows us to respect people regardless of whether or not they conform to Western notions about what a human being or what an identity should look like. This is an independent reason to vote for the counterplan instead of the 1AC. What is the disadvantage? You say that secession movements are failing within the status quo. This isn't our argument. We can do specific analysis of 2 regions versus Sudan versus the Blue Nile region in Sudan, which is the southern region of northern Sudan. And secondly, the conflict between Turkey and the Kurdish populations within Turkey. These 2 movements specifically right now are on the brink. The United Nations has advocated for demilitarization of the Blue Nile region, which is causing the secessionist conflict to decrease within the world of the status quo. In addition, this morning, this morning, the Turkish government and the Kurdish rebellion parties have agreed to enter into negotiations over how to resolve the decades-long civil conflict that is happening. However, you articulate that this other issues, we isolate these 2 issues as uniquely specific. And our link arguments say that when these 2 issues, we're on the brink right now to see that these secessionist movements are being supported in other places. It means that they stop the current peaceful negotiations that they're in. And in Sudan, this means that they're continuing to militarize the zone because both the south and the north want the Blue Nile region in Turkey, and means that the Kurdish population thinks that they can secede from Turkey, and it means that they don't enter these peaceful negotiations and increase the violent actions that are happening. This has a short-term impact, which happens in the interim because it happens right away. In addition, you say no one would want to model it. You make all these terms about peaceful reconciliation. We're giving you specific analysis that says what would happen. In addition, you say this disincentivizes government crackdowns. The government crackdown is going to happen as soon as these populations, these zones are militarized, and as soon as the Kurdish population pulls out of peace negotiations. You say this as a precedent calling for a referendum. We articulate that the counterplan is capable of solving back to this because it also sets a precedent. In addition, we articulate that the counterplan is uniquely key because it engages in the peaceful process, which is what is currently happening, which means it doesn't treat it like the DISED. We're controlling the internal to terrorism because we've shown you specifically how Iran is funneling terrorist supplies and money laundering through the Kurdish populations in Turkey in order to be able to fund these military regimes. It means if you don't solve for the Turkish conflict, you're never going to be able to solve for the root cause of the impact to the 1AC. In addition, the conflict with China increased proxy wars, which is a unique impact that the government doesn't access.
Okay. I'm going to talk about some impact versions of this. The counterplan is capable of solving the entirety of the affirmative, and the counterplan solves the act much better than the action of the affirmative. Look, what they're saying is the affirmative action is we're going to hold a referendum. It might fail, it might succeed. In fact, the MG himself says the referendum will probably fail. This means that what they're really saying is we're doing nothing to solve violence. We're doing nothing to solve terrorism. The counterplan results in an actual action, which means that there's only a risk that the counterplan can solve violence and solve non-state actor takeover much better than the affirmative. Look, I think this is a fairly intuitive argument, that if you have a referendum and that referendum fails, then it probably means that the only way that you can have what you want, the only way that you can get any influence in the government is through violent action and through non-state actor action, which means that there's only a propensity that the failure of the affirmative action results in more violence and more terrorism than is happening in the status quo without any action, which means that overall, even without the counterplan, the affirmative is still not a very good idea. On the counterplan, I think that only we are capable of creating a border that the North and the South like, which is necessary to solving things like violence and solving non-state actor control of the government. The process of having a referendum that doesn't solve terrorism. If you have a referendum that doesn't result in any action, you can't solve a problem. This only indicates to people that the only way that you can solve a problem is through taking action against the government instead of using a political process. If your political process fails, there's not a way that the affirmative can create a modeling institution for the future. Furthermore, you say that the government will crack down in a world of the counterplan, but I fail to see how the affirmative stops government crackdown, especially if the affirmative doesn't result in action. Also, the transition is happening right now, which means that there's only a risk that the affirmative actually increases the violence that would happen as a result of this. Furthermore, without a permutation in this debate, there's not a good resolution for the affirmative in the PMR. I just don't think that he has a very good offensive strategy left ahead of him. His MG just does not give him enough outs, especially when the MG is conceding the argument that you can't solve cultural legitimacy in a world of the plan. This is an independent net benefit to the counterplan. We say that cultural legitimacy is key to stopping violence. If you have an entire government that just wipes over and rolls over people and is violent towards people, I think that the only way that you can resolve that problem is by having those people be able to come to the table and say, this is what we want. This is what we want from the government. And only that can happen in a world of collaboration with all relevant stakeholders as per the counterplan. This is a unique counterplan action that the affirmative is never capable of accessing. And we say that this sort of cultural legitimacy is key to solving structural violence that creates the conditions that allow terrorism to occur. This also creates the justification for why violence can happen, which means that the counterplan has better solvency strength, which means that the counterplan is much more probable to resolve any sort of impact than the affirmative. Also, the referendum is a Western notion of democracy that we are imposing on another country. We say that the type of action that the counterplan takes is much more in tune with the actual culture of the people in Yemen, which means that it is more descriptive of what would create better cultural legitimacy. On the disadvantage, there are lots of things that the MG says that are preceded with turn, but don't have any warrants that I can see, which means that you should be very skeptical of any PMR extrapolation of these arguments. I think that you should be very skeptical of any explosion of these arguments. Look, I think it's fairly simple. Instability in the Kurdish region of Turkey and the Blue Nile, which are terrorist hotbeds, means that there, in the short term, is an explosion of terrorism, especially if the referendum fails. Look, it was damning for the affirmative to concede that the referendum will fail because it means that this will cause terrorism internationally as well as within Yemen, which is a much larger impact that they are creating than they are resolving. The counterplan results a larger magnitudinal impact and a much more probable magnitudinal impact, which means that the counterplan is the preferable policy option.
The order will be a float overview, advantage 1, advantage 2, counterplan, decide on one. Is everybody ready?
Mm-hmm.
The ballot in this debate round will read that there's a solvency deficit in the counterplan, which mirrors the only unique impact in this debate round, that of advantage number 1. We make multiple arguments on the counterplan flow, specifically that the counterplan will allow for the government to step in and seem like a puppet. That argument is a pretty intuitive argument about allowing all equal access stakeholders to the text of the counterplan, and the problem with that, which is that the government is the corrupt one in the status quo. That can be coupled with the argument that the counterplan and the plan capture the same benefit that of collaboration. Our argument is that holding a vote allows for things like discussions and exactly what your counterplan text says to happen before the vote. That's the reason why the plan and the counterplan capture the same advantage of discussion. The only unique impact left is that of advantage number 1. They are dropping defensive arguments and say there's no link to the dissent. That argument goes conceded, which means the only offense is advantage 1, and the question is who controls that? Advantage 1. They go for the argument that referendums don't work. We have a couple of responses. We isolate the example of Hamas, which Matt extended throughout today's debate in multiple places, that when Hamas got political legitimacy, even just through an election, which bear in mind they lost several as well, they were forced to move more to the center. That argument never gets responded to by the negative bloc. Our argument that the act of holding an election, regardless of if it's a yes or no vote, is an act that forces a group into political legitimacy, which is a uniquely different thing. You can remember these words from the 1AC, because I took time to explain a lot of them. I also read arguments about how, like the IRA, for example, what happened during elections, that's on advantage number 2, you can look there too. Our argument is that actually allows for referendum. Their argument is that it makes it seem more emboldened because it makes it seem like the government's co-opting them and destroying them. That argument is probably a lot of response to how referendums have worked in the past, which allows for political legitimacy. It's also seems nonsensical because we are winning a uniqueness argument that that's already happening in the status quo. The government is already attacking protests. That's Matt's response to your argument that there's more turmoil. I state the example that we actually decrease this turmoil because that's what's happening now. There's only a risk that an election gives some kind of legitimacy to the party that forces them then to move more towards the middle. That's a pretty good argument. Their argument the political process is genuine, but our argument that votes happen. That makes it seem genuine. It also gives an avenue that's outside of violent protests. Both of those seem to jive with our story that referendums work just by having one, which would be a reason how we decrease conflict in the status quo. On advantage 2. They're not going for an offensive argument. They go for the argument that local leaders are corrupt. Our argument is probably better, which is that we allow for referendums, which have already happened. You guys think they voted out Saleh, which is the previously corrupt leader, which probably indicates that local corruption is being solved in the status quo. Both of their arguments and responses don't seem to come to terms with the fact that the voting out Saleh represents a new, unique political climate, which is less corrupt than the status quo. That'd be a reason why advantage number 2 doesn't go the direction, and also a reason why we can have a referendum and not make it co-opted by the government. Next. You're going to extend across advantage number 1. Sorry, I jumped a little bit there. But we are reading a unique impact about regional instability and how that affects millions of lives. That is a reason why you can have a net probable impact, which never goes questioned in debate around. It also probably makes it inevitable. Matt reading these arguments how increased non-state actor recruitment and how Turkey instability makes your dissent probably inevitable because it means there's a regional instability that happens that can spread. I say in advantage number 1 that this regional instability has spread. I say the example of Africa war, border conflict or civil war conflict spread. That would be a reason why I think like Turkey would probably be inevitable, which Yemen is going down. Counterclaim. I only need 2 arguments to meet this counterclaim. I want Matt's number 2, which says there's no solvency. We guys take the example that your counterplan seems less legitimate because it's a puppet state. Their argument is that that's only true for plan. That doesn't make sense. Our argument that your counterplan includes all legitimate stakeholders, includes the state government and the status quo, which would be the reason why it gets co-opted, and also why the northern government would just shift the talks to never allow for southern rights. That's a pretty good argument about why a corrupt government in the north would continue this. It also means that advantage one then becomes a disadvantage, to be massive protest, and the regional stability that happened would be also triggered about that. That's the reason why you can reject the counterplan on face. Next, they go for those colonialism arguments. I only need to respond like send Matt's number 4. Matt's number 4 arguments this plan allows for cooperation. Obviously, when there's a voting, there's also discussion before the vote. We have political elections in the United States. That would be a reason why the kind of discussion which you have as colonialism net benefit would also happen in the world of the plan, because the discussion would resolve this conflict, because you have the discussion happening, which you say is uniquely Yemen culture. Arguments that happens in elections as well, which means it goes our direction as well. Dissa.
Point of order.
Yep.
I think that any argument that you replicate the lost process, which is why you solve for colonialism, is completely not probably should have
Yeah. So Matt's number 4 argument is the plan resolves all benefits, net benefits of collaboration. Your net benefit of collaboration is colonialism.
But it's not, I'm sure it's under consideration. It's not contextualized to the process. It's fine.
On the disadvantage, extend across Matt's number 3 argument, which says, no link, the plan does not create a new country. It goes cold, conceded debate round. We agree the elections are lost. That is devastating for you because there's no new framework that happens, because no one would demand for a new country to have sovereignty if the election doesn't go their direction, right? Their arguments are all based on sovereignty groups gaining power. Our argument is the plan shows that's a loss, which means that no other country would ever call for the 1AC to happen, which would be a reason why we have zero risk of a link to Turkey and Kurds freaking out. They don't respond to a lick of this argument. Our argument is that yes, the election fails, and if the election fails, no one else calls for it, and when that happens, there is no risk of an impact. They have to win a link that other groups would call for it. They don't win that link, which means the dissent doesn't happen.
We're gonna.
Yep.
That works.
Try to keep your foot.
Plus 9 minutes. Good run.
Good debate.
Good.
you want us to step outside?
Sure, you can. I'm just gonna look over. Let me just turn the camera on.